Hi, I'm Tony Russo, and this is In Case You Missed It from Kates-Boylston for the week ending Friday, November 15th, 2024. So I am freshly back from Advances in Funeral Innovations, the conference that we held this week in Houston, Texas. Lots of great conversations. I love the hanging out parts. I love taking the photos, and I love seeing the whole presentation after having interviewed everyone about their sneak preview aspect of it. And we will be posting the presentations as we edit them. I'm going to be editing them. There is going to be a lot of editing to do. They were all great presentations. We have 2 camera angles. It should be pretty cool once we put it out. But the one that I want to talk about this week is the presentation made by Darren Crouch of Passages International. Also, he is the president of the Green Burial Council. And he spoke about planting trees using cremated human remains. And the shortest version is they're not great for trees, but he is, selling a product that does turn a person into a tree. And in their product, in the Passages product, there's a kind of nutrient dense disc that goes in it that helps convert the cremated remains into nutrients. So just throwing cremated remains around trees isn't great for the tree. It doesn't harm the person, and it doesn't necessarily harm the tree. But if you want to use the remains to grow a tree, you've got to add lots of nutrients. And I'll have a link to the particular Passages product in the show notes, and you can take a look at that and then at least get a sense of what kind of things need to be done with cremated remains if you want to turn them into trees. Other than that, I had a great time speaking with the students who were there. They were all very, very kind to me because I'm old and confused. And it was also great to host the panel. And all of that, hopefully, we'll be putting online sooner rather than later. The panel, if the audio came out very well, will probably be one of our year-end podcasts, because I think it gave a flavor of the conference without giving away too much, but it brought context to a lot of our conversations, and there were so many great conversations. I just can't begin to tell you. So stay tuned for a ping on that, because I will let you know as soon as these videos come up in the In Case You Missed It that I do every Friday. Toward the end of October, the New Jersey Assembly passed a bill that would allow dual licensure in the state. That's not quite the way they phrased it, but for people in the industry, it makes the most sense to talk about it that way. So they may have a license that allows for embalming and a license that allows for funeral directing. This isn't terribly odd. That is the case in several states do have dual licenses, but the move from a single license to a dual license is a little bit different, and there's a lot of baggage that comes with a bill like this. First of all, because there's a national accreditation process that requires embalming, but the industry doesn't require embalming at the level that it did. And as we move toward a higher cremation percentage and also toward a lower interest in having embalming, we'll probably see more of this. New Jersey is certainly not even the only state considering it. I referenced the conference, and one of the great conversations that I think came out of the conference, and we reported on it in Funeral Service Insider. Actually, I'm sorry, the story's not out yet, but we will soon report on it in Funeral Service Insider, the newsletter. This disconnect between the way families see a funeral, and there are many people who believe that we've hit a point now where people, are more interested in thinking about remembering the person that they lost more than trying to remember the body, the the preserving the body is less important to more people than preserving the memory. And the cost of, as many people have said before, the cost of preserving the body for many families would be better spent as the cost of preserving the memory. And more families are kind of drifting toward that expense rather than the embalming expense. And people are also increasingly less interested in making sure that they have an open casket as they're beginning to pre-plan their own funerals. They are thinking about what they want, and embalming is increasingly not high on the list. But, and I've mentioned this before in articles, and I've mentioned it in editorials, and I'll probably do a larger feature on it early next year. They're not having an embalming class doesn't mean that the first time you should handle a dead body is when you're already a funeral director. I think it would be wise to have some sort of preparation requirements. So, ritual washings, for example, and just regular dressings, and being familiar with how to handle and how to respect human remains I think it's an important part. And I think that's why people are nervous about doing away with the embalming. But there are also schools, and I've spoken with teachers that have trouble finding enough bodies to make the embalming portion of the requirements feasible. And that if you have a mortuary school and you're not associated, for example, with a medical school, and you have difficulty getting your hands on cadavers, it can be a challenge. So we'll follow this legislation, and I'm going to do a larger feature again in early 2025 on kind of the state of the dual license and the state of the move toward the dual license, because it's something it's almost certainly coming. And the question is, how is it going to affect the way that we teach and what we expect from and require of funeral directors? Because, with no offense intended to my friends in the insurance business, funeral directors aren't just selling pre-need and embalming bodies. There's a lot more. I'm not telling you anything, but there's a lot more to it. And I would hate to feel like people think of funeral directors as just disposition specialists, although it's a real fear, something we talked about a lot at the conference and something that makes its way into the pages of all of our publications. There is this fear that by focusing so hard on either direct cremation or embalming and a large service, the industry may paint itself into this kind of disposition corner or allow itself maybe to be painted into this kind of disposition corner. And preventing that from happening is everybody's job. It's part of making sure that funeral service is something that people respect as the caretakers of the dead, as well as the grief facilitators for the living. So more on that, but a link in the show notes to the gentleman who wrote the legislation. I wrote a small op-ed on it, so I'll use that as a way to link through to all of the legislation, and we will continue to follow this story. The Cremation Association of North America, CANA, has announced that it will have, for the first time in 5 years, an increase in its membership fees. There is a link in the show notes to a chart that shows where all of the new prices are. The student memberships have stayed the same. All the other memberships appear to have gone up just a little bit, but it's to accommodate, their expenses. They do a lot of good work over there at CANA, and it has to be funded. One of the things that was interesting in the release was that the executive director, Barbara Kemmis, who's been on the on the Funeral Service Insider podcast, and there's a link to her podcast, which was really good, in the show notes as well. She said that when she came on board, almost all of the funding for Cana's work, including the workshops they put on and the lobbying and all of the work that they do for cremation in America, in the North Americas, was funded by membership fees. And since she's come on, by doing different classes and by forging different partnerships, only about 35% of their budget relies on membership dues, but it does rely on those dues. And I would encourage you, if you're in cremation, this is an association that's worth your support and worth your participation. And there is a link in the show notes. So in Billings, Montana, Mount View Cemetery recently had their first natural burial in 150 or so years. There's a long feature that's behind a paywall, and I've linked to it anyway, but it was really interesting to watch the consumer media try to explain that natural burial isn't necessarily new, and it was hard for them to explain that that green burials were returning to Billings, because the first people who were buried in the cemetery were buried before embalming, so they were just put in a biodegradable coffin, probably a literal coffin, and buried in the ground. And now, by now they're gone, or most of the way gone. And then, we've had embalming, and we've had, more sustainable caskets, more durable caskets, and we've had, the proliferation of vaults. And so the author was clearly having trouble articulating this this notion that natural burial isn't new. Green burials aren't new. They have been interrupted for the last 150 or so years by non-green burials. And it's interesting to see the way it's playing out in the conversation about green burial. And I like this notion of using return when you're talking about green burials, instead of, this 500-year-old cemetery didn't just have its first green burial this year. This is probably a 200-year-old cemetery, but it still didn't have its first green burial this year. It had its first green burial in a while. And it's weird for us, I guess, from the inside to kind of know that right in our head, that green burials aren't new, and people are returning to them. So we're trying to use that language a little bit more, and you'll see the rest of the story if you follow the link in the show notes. That will do me for this week. In case you missed it, is a Kates-Boylston production. It was written, edited, and videoed by me, Tony Russo. Please subscribe wherever you're listening now. Follow along if you're on Apple. If you have any feedback, we would love to hear it. Please direct it to either the comments section, if the comment sections are your thing. Otherwise, you can reach me by going through the show notes and clicking on my email address. If you want to write it down, it is arusso@K like kite, B like boy, publications.com. That is arusso@kbpublications.com. You can reach me there via email, and we will check in with you next time on In Case You Missed It.